Welcome to the third lecture for Between War and Peace. In today's lecture, we're going to focus on economic sanctions. In the last lecture, we looked at just war theory and in particular the criteria of jus ad bellum and jus in bello, focusing on the question of last resort. In today's lecture, we're going to turn to economic sanctions, which are largely seen as one of the main alternatives to go into war. We're also going to be looking at arms embargoes. In the first half of the lecture, we're going to look at economic sanctions. Second half of the lecture, we'll focus on arms embargoes. Arms embargoes can be seen as a form of military sanction, which means that in the first half of the lecture, we're going to look at economic sanctions. In the second half of the lecture, you can see us looking at military sanctions. Next week, we're going to focus on diplomacy and in particular forms of diplomatic sanctions. Today's lecture is going to be split up into three parts. The first two parts will focus on economic sanctions, and the third part will focus on arms embargoes. Sanctions appear to be the most obvious alternative to direct military intervention. At the end of the First World War, Woodrow Wilson, the then President of the United States, famously proclaimed that a nation boycotted is a nation that is in sight of surrender. Apply this economic, peaceful, silent, deadly remedy, and there will be no need for force. It is a terrible remedy. It does not cost a life outside the nation boycotted, but it brings pressure upon the nation that, in my judgment, no modern nation could resist. The use of economic sanctions has hugely increased after the end of the Cold War, reaching over 300 cases between 1990 and 1995, and they continue to be frequently used today. For instance, between February 2014 and February 2015, in a single year, the United States, a single country, introduced or amended at least 20 different sanctions regimes. As we're going to look at today, sanctions are also highly controversial. They've been widely criticized for failing to realize their policy goals. They're also criticized for being indiscriminate and for leading to widespread suffering. The comprehensive sanctions regime against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, in particular, has been widely criticized as being morally reprehensible. Criticism of economic sanctions is so extensive that it's even suggested that war may be preferable to sanctions. The point is often made in the context of what we looked at last week, the principle of last resort. As we saw last week, it's sometimes claimed that it's better to go to war than to launch a comprehensive economic sanctions regime that wreaks havoc upon the country affected.
To punish Saddam Hussein for invading Kuwait and to make sure he doesn't do anything like that again or worse, the UN imposed sanctions on Iraq, the harshest, most comprehensive sanctions in modern times. Very little goes into the country, virtually no oil goes out. The United States says there wouldn't be any sanctions at all if Saddam stopped lying about his destructive weapons and complied with UN demands. Meanwhile, it's no secret that the sanctions are causing hardships. But as we learned on our recent trip to Iraq, it's not the leaders who are suffering, it's the people, and especially the children. An estimated 500,000 children, 500,000, have died. This is a ward in a pediatric hospital in Baghdad for severely malnourished children. We came here without any government interference. In fact, we were allowed to go to any hospital we wanted to. We saw 5 in all, and wander around without restrictions. And everywhere we went, we saw children like these, malnourished, some close to starvation. We saw children who needed medicine they couldn't get. These 2 babies had to share an incubator which was broken and couldn't be repaired. We even heard of cases where gauze for operations was being reused. And this little boy died of pneumonia an hour after we took these pictures because there were no antibiotics.
This is quite a very serious case, actually. This child is 22 months old.
Almost 2 years old.
Yeah, doctor told me.
Jane Pierce works for the United Nations World Food Program.
Most people don't realize what's going on. They don't see pictures of babies like we've just seen here. You know, babies that are a third of their recommended weight.
Before 1990, before the war and before these sanctions, was this all unheard of in this country?
Yeah, yes.
Did not exist at all. Most Iraqis are suffering. We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Worth it because she believes is negotiating with Iraq not to lift the sanctions, but to allow that country to sell a limited amount of oil to buy food and medicine.
I should add that the video claims that 500,000 civilians have been killed. That statistic is now actually being highly questioned. Notwithstanding, it's still very clear that sanctions really did increase the harm on Iraq generally. In response to the worries about comprehensive sanctions, there's been a move away from comprehensive multilateral sanctions. States now engage much more in what's called targeted or smart sanctions. These have been particularly prevalent since the early 2000s. They include measures such as asset freezes, travel bans, smart trade sanctions, and arms embargoes. Let's explore them in more detail, since it's often a bit unclear what it means to say that sanctions are smart or targeted. Firstly, comprehensive sanctions. They ban all trade in goods. They might still allow for some import of food and medical materials under a humanitarian exception. The Oil for Food program in Iraq, for instance, allowed Saddam Hussein's Iraq to sell some oil to buy food and other basic supplies in order to alleviate the humanitarian suffering. One of the further issues, though, is that the sales of the oil were wildly misappropriated, with much of the proceeds not actually reaching the Iraqi people that were suffering. Now, these forms of comprehensive sanctions are in fact far less common these days. More likely is that sanctions are targeted at particular goods and commodities. These commodities include weapons, such as arms embargoes, which we're going to look at in the second part of today's lecture. They also include materials necessary related to the conflict, such as diamonds or other goods, such as oil, that are economically or politically important. Second point, sanctions may be unilateral or multilateral. That is, they might be undertaken by one particular state. A recent example is the ongoing US comprehensive sanctions regime on Iran.
Over the weekend, the U.S. effort to restore virtually all previously terminated UN sanctions on the Islamic Republic of Iran, including the arms embargo, pursuant to UN Security Council Resolution 2231. The Trump administration has always been honest about what the Iranian regime really is. A radical revolutionary and the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism and anti-Semitism. President Trump understood that the JCPOA was an abject failure. It didn't bring Iran into the community of nations or block Tehran's path to a nuclear weapon. Instead, it was an exercise in appeasement. It gifted the regime billions and paved the way for Iran to become the arms dealer of choice for terrorist groups and dictators all across the world in just 5 short years. Just imagine what Iran would do if we were able to freely purchase more advanced weapons. We have no intention of letting that happen. The President's executive order announced today gives us a new and powerful tool to enforce the UN arms embargo and hold those who seek to evade UN sanctions accountable. Today, I will take the first action under this new executive order by sanctioning the Iranian Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics and Iran's Defense Industries Organization and its director. We're also sanctioning the previous president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, For nearly 2 years, corrupt officials in Tehran have worked with the illegitimate regime in Venezuela to flout the UN arms embargo. Our actions today are a warning that should be heard worldwide. No matter who you are, if you violate the UN arms embargo on Iran, you risk sanctions. I'm also announcing sanctions on Hamid Reza Gardarani and Ahmad Shivai under an existing U.S. authority targeting proliferators of weapons of mass destruction. These individuals are central to Iran's uranium enrichment operations. When we launched the maximum pressure campaign back in 2018 under President Trump's leadership, the critics said it wouldn't work. They were wrong. Our sanctions have saved countless Muslim, Jewish, and Christian lives by denying Tehran access to more than $70 billion that could have otherwise gone to terror. We've done this all while keeping a channel open for humanitarian trade and assistance. As we are demonstrating today, we'll keep it up until the Iranian regime comes to the table and accepts a real deal for change in its behavior. The American people should know that we will always put their safety first.
That was Mike Pompeo speaking last month. In addition, sanctions may be multilateral in the sense that they're regional. An example is the EU's sanctions on Russia in light of its annexation of Crimea. Sanctions may be multilateral in addition in the sense that they're authorized by the UN Security Council. In the 1990s, the UN imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iraq in response to its invasion of Kuwait and its attempt to develop weapons of mass destruction, on Yugoslavia during the breakup of Yugoslavia and the subsequent civil war, and Haiti after the overthrow of Jean-Bertrand Aristide. More recently, however, the UN Security Council has avoided such a comprehensive approach, particularly in light of the sanctions regime in Iraq. It instead has focused on certain goods or particular individuals. This is to such an extent that the UN has not imposed comprehensive sanctions since the 1990s. This brings me to the next key feature, which concerns the target of economic sanctions. Sanctions may be targeted at the state in general, at particular individuals such as leaders at their families, selected firms, business groups, political parties, non-state actors or regimes such as the Taliban. For instance, the EU or UN Security Council may freeze the bank account of a ruler or seize the assets of a suspected terrorist. Alternatively, the sanctions may be general, that is not targeted at particular individuals, but rather a good or asset more generally. Targeted sanctions can then take the following forms: commodity and sectorial sanctions. These restrict the trade in specific commodities, such as diamonds and timber, and those related to certain sectors, such as the oil industry. Travel restrictions, which include travel bans for particular individuals and their families, as well as bans on commercial flights. Financial sanctions, which include asset freezes of particular individuals' assets or the assets of governments, restrictions of access to international markets and banks, bans on capital investment, and suspensions of loans or aid. Now, when you're reading about this topic, the labels of smart sanctions or targeted sanctions are often used to denote sanctions on first particular goods and second particular individuals or groups. One query, however, though, is whether these labels are in fact somewhat misleading. The labels can ally to the targeting of particular goods and assets with the targeting of particular individuals. This can give the impression that smart sanctions don't involve any collateral damage because they're just focusing on particular individuals, those who seem to be clearly liable to some form of action. But as we're going to see shortly, smart sanctions on particular goods or particular sectors of the society can still be indiscriminate and cause significant suffering amongst individuals, even though they're viewed as targeted or smart. So what's important to bring out is that targeted sanctions, smart sanctions, can vary significantly in how targeted or how smart they are. That is, how discriminating the measure in fact is. Those that are focused on particular individuals tend to be more targeted, whereas those targeted on particular goods tend not to be, tend to be much more broader in their effects. Now, one final thing to highlight to you before we go on to some more queries is that there's in fact a sanctions app. You can download this on the phone, on your phone, very useful source. You can see that on my phone just about, maybe. Camera's not quite picking it up. There we go, sort of. Very useful source produced by the Graduate Center in Geneva, really one of the top institutions for economic sanctions, lists all the major sanctions cases. Comprehensive sanctions generally receive a bad rap. Indeed, critics sometimes reject outright the permissibility of broader sanctions. Let's look at some of these arguments. The central objection to sanctions is what we can call the liability objection. In short, this holds that sanctions are impermissible because they harm the innocent. They harm those who are not liable to be harmed. According to Joy Gordon, one of the main critics of economic sanctions, particularly from the ethical perspective, argues that they are inconsistent with the principle of discrimination from just war doctrine. Recall, as we saw last week, this says it's impermissible to target innocent civilians. More specifically, she argues they appear to violate the principle of non-combatant immunity, which says that civilians should not be targeted during conflict. How do sanctions harm? Well, this is most obvious for the comprehensive multilateral sanctions of those of the kind that were imposed upon Iraq in the 1990s. Many of those who bore the brunt, as we've already seen, were children and the vulnerable. One response to this objection, one query to this objection, is to argue that those in the state who are subject to sanctions are liable to them because they are collectively responsible for the unjust threat. So the thought here is this. You might think that Russians should bear the costs of, for instance, Russian aggression in Crimea because the Russians are collectively responsible for Russian foreign policy. It is therefore okay, the response runs, for the EU to impose costs on all Russian civilians because it's their country, it's their country, Russia. But why? Imagine that you're a Russian civilian who opposes the annexation of Crimea. You are hurt by the sanctions on Russia and lose your livelihood. You do as much as you can to campaign for a proper democracy in Russia, openly campaign, for instance, against the annexation in Crimea. Are you still collectively responsible for Russia's foreign policy? You might think instead that there are in fact clear limits to when you can be held collectively responsible. For instance, your views need to be represented in your country's decision making. You might think that we could be collectively held in the UK as responsible for the Brexit vote, for the election of Boris Johnson, and the subsequent harms, if you believe there will be harms that might result if there's a no Brexit deal. That seems a clearer case, potentially, where collective responsibility seems that you might be able to assign liability on the basis of it. Not a completely clear-cut case, but a clearer case. Seems far more dubious, though, if you don't live in a democracy, that you can be held collectively responsible. And often the targets of sanctions regimes will not be those in democracies. Clearly, we don't think, for instance, that the Iraqi children or the vulnerable population in Iraq in the 1990s, subject to the great harms of the sanctions, were responsible for Saddam Hussein's policies. One might also think against this liability objection is that smart sanctions only harm those who are liable and avoid the objection. This is sometimes suggested in the public debate. But I've already suggested this seems to be mistaken. It's not only broader sanctions regimes, comprehensive sanctions regimes that fall foul of this liability objection. Smart sanctions can too. Targeted sanctions on particular individuals and sanctions of particular goods can also impose harms on those who are innocent. Let's look at this in a little bit more detail to get a better handle on the types of smart sanctions and the harms that they can cause. Firstly, smart trade sanctions on particular industries such as timber, oil, can damage an important sector of the economy and undermine the exports of the state. As a result, it can weaken its ability to fulfill basic governmental functions. For example, the EU has banned the import of crude oil from Syria. This was estimated to be about $450 million per month. According to some reports, the sanctions on Syria worsened already the very dire humanitarian situation, increasing economic deterioration, unemployment, falling salaries, raising the price of basic commodities, and worsening access to public health and clean water. We see then that the costs of the sanctions regime on Syria were passed down to the population. It was also reported earlier this year that in response to the US sanctions regime on Iran, the Iranian government admitted that the supposedly targeted sanctions made it far more difficult for it to obtain vital medical supplies and equipment to treat COVID-19 patients. The result was an increase in the death toll. Second, smart financial sanctions can also have general notable effects. The freezing of a central bank's assets can jeopardize the economy of a state. It can mean that several welfare and commercial activities are significantly weakened, with negative effects for the general population. So, hospitals, basic welfare payments, social care can all potentially be jeopardized. Thirdly, travel bans, asset freezes on particular individuals. On the face of it, these seem like they're less likely to cause collateral harm. However, sometimes they can be imposed upon those who are in fact innocent. In the wake of 9/11, the Security Council passed Resolution 1267. This imposed asset freezes on only those suspected of being terrorists. The process by which this resolution was imposed was very heavily criticised, including for its opaqueness and for its lack of appeal, and ultimately for harming those who are innocent, those simply suspected of crimes. Billions of dollars had to be paid in compensation to targets for not receiving proper statements of the reasons for their listing on the sanctions and for wrongful listings. A different response takes an alternative line. It says that targeted sanctions are less likely to harm innocent civilians. It doesn't claim that they're not going to harm innocent civilians, less likely to do harm. So the claim here is that all feasible responses to aggression and mass atrocities that we're going to look at, including targeted sanctions, including doing nothing, typically harm those who are not liable. In the case of doing nothing, innocents who are currently subject to the threat of aggression, currently subject to mass atrocities, will have to continue to bear harms for which they are not liable. Similarly, war, of course, clearly almost always involves the imposition of harms on those not liable to harm. So on this response, it follows that broader and targeted sanctions, comprehensive and smart sanctions, in other words, can still be justifiable. If no option can avoid the liability objection, we need to look to the objection which results in the least amount of harm. And sanctions, this reply says, will result sometimes in the least amount of harm. This is, of course, contingent. It depends on whether sanctions are likely to involve the least amount of harm. And this depends in turn on how effective sanctions are at addressing the situations. And this is what we're going to get on to shortly.